Have you ever struggled to know what to say when one of your guests stops talking? Or do you occasionally muddle through some of your questions with lots of ums, ahs and filler language? Well, firstly, don't worry, it happens to everyone most of the time. And in this video, we're going to give you 9 tips on how you can record smoother conversations and capture more captivating content from your guests. If you're a podcast fan, you've probably heard at least a couple of bad interviews, meandering guests, clunky segues, boring questions, a host that just won't stop talking about themselves. You get the picture. But done right, podcast interviews sound easy. Conversation flows effortlessly from one topic to the next, and both the host and the guest sound like they're enjoying themselves. But it doesn't happen by magic. Interviewing is a skill and it takes practice. It's all about genuine interest, digging deeper, extracting stories, defining the unclear, avoiding awkwardness, and being conscious of all that at the same time. I know it's a lot, but that's exactly why we've made this video. The following 9 tips should help you feel more confident, relaxed, and prepared when recording your next interviews. So, let's get into it. Tip number 1 is absolutely vital. Only speak to people you're actually interested in. Half of the art of recording better podcast interviews comes down to selecting compelling guests. And the number 1 guiding rule to follow is whether you're genuinely interested in hearing what that person has to say. Don't interview someone just because they're famous or because they have an impressive job title. If you don't actually care about what they do, listeners will pick up on your fake curiosity in your questions, and you'll come across rigid and canned, and your conversation just won't sound anywhere near interesting. If you want to find ideal guests quickly, we'd recommend checking out matchmaker.fm. It's a free platform specifically designed to connect podcasters and guests. All you need to do is sign up and fill in a few details about your show, and then you'll be able to browse through a database of thousands of guest profiles and book the most relevant ones to appear on your show. Tip number 2 is to get your prep done as efficiently as possible. A quick word of warning here though. Doing too much research will make your conversations feel rigid, but not doing enough will come across as rude and disrespectful. So you do need to find the sweet spot and hit it right in the middle. And here's what we recommend. First, read their about page. Try to detect any aspect of their personality that shines through in the text, and keep an eye out for anything interesting or unusual about them. That's often where the seeds of a great story lie. Next, check out their social media. Are they active on Twitter, LinkedIn or Instagram? What topics have they posted about recently? Have they shared any interesting articles? These are often great ways to kick off discussion in an interview. Doing so demonstrates that you've done your research, and it gives your guests a chance to talk about topics currently on their mind. And lastly, listen to a few other interviews they've done. This will give you a good feel for the topics they're most enthusiastic about and how they're likely to come across on the show. Pay attention to how they communicate. Do they generally give long answers or short ones? Do they go off track occasionally? These are helpful things you need to know in advance. Tip number 3 is to prepare and ask probing questions. As you do your research, think about the questions you could be asking. Try to find creative angles, because if you ask the same questions everyone else does, you're going to get the same rehearsed answers. Try to take the questions they've been asked before and take them one step further. For example, I've heard you say A, but I didn't really get a sense of B. Could you talk a little bit more about that? If your show aims to focus on helping listeners learn, focus on asking the how and why questions. Try to get your guests to give concrete examples, anecdotes, tips and case studies. These are much more meaningful to listeners than abstract theory. Drawing up a few questions in advance is a great way to prepare, but you shouldn't stick to them rigidly. It's important to retain a degree of flexibility and openness during the conversation. If all you do is read off your list, the conversation isn't going to flow naturally, and the interview won't go into any areas of real depth. Tip number 4 is to nail down your pre-interview process. Give your guests a brief elevator pitch for your show, and remind them of who your target audience is. Having that fresh in their heads is going to help tailor their answers more precisely to your audience. You should also outline the next steps that will happen after recording. Where will the episode be published? How will it be promoted? When will it be live? Is there likely to be a significant delay before the episode is released? Let them know before. And lastly, give your guests the opportunity to ask you any questions they might have about you before starting recording. If you're dealing with experienced guests, this process usually takes less than 5 minutes, but be prepared to take a bit longer for those guests that need it. Tip number 5 is to keep the conversation moving forward. Keep your questions clear, concise and direct. The less words, the better. Your listeners primarily want to hear from your guest, not you. so don't ramble at length about your own thoughts and your own opinions. If your guest goes off on tangents, that's fine, but only go with them if you feel it's in the interest of your listeners. If you feel things are stagnating or going too far off topic, don't be afraid to reel your guest back in with a prepared question. As the interviewer, you should be the one steering the direction of the conversation, not your guest. And tip number 6 is to avoid interrupting. It can come across as rude and is usually very irritating for listeners. Of course, there may be times where it's necessary to interrupt your guest to get the conversation back on track, but these instances are the exception rather than the rule. If your guest mentions something you want to dig deeper on, write it down on a notepad and raise it when they've finished making their point. Also, when your guest is speaking, remain silent. It can be tempting to vocalise agreement with noises like, uh-huh, yeah, But these clutter your recording and take away from what your guest is saying, so they're best left out. Tip number 7 is to practice active listening. This one is a bit more difficult to master, but it will come with time and experience. Try not to obsess over the next question you're going to ask as your guest is talking. If you do, you'll completely miss the point they're making, and your response will feel awkward and disjointed. Obviously, you don't want dead air after your guest has finished talking, so rehearsing your next question in your head can make you feel more prepared. But it will also prevent the conversation from getting into a real flow. As your guest talks, pay close attention. Try to visualise the things they are saying. Doing so will help you formulate a more natural response, and your interview will sound all the better for it. If worse comes to worse and your mind goes blank, you've always got your backup question to fall on. Tip number 8 is to listen back to your previous interviews. As you play back your interviews, listen with a critical ear. Could you have asked the same question in less words? Will your listeners be able to easily follow the conversation? Were there any sticking points that broke the flow of the interview? Did you manage to cover your key questions in the time permitted? And lastly, our final tip today is to learn from the master interviewers. Find an interviewer whose style you like and try to break it down into a more granular level. What makes them stand out? How could you implement some of their techniques into your own interviews? Be careful not to hide behind an imitation of someone else though. The best interviewers let your personality shine in their questioning. Listen to others you admire, take notes on that, and then put your own unique spin on them. That's all for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you found any of these tips helpful, then please consider hitting that like button. And if you've got any questions about interviewing, drop them down below and we'll get back to you. And lastly, we do publish a new episode of the Podcast Lab series quite regularly, so make sure that you hit subscribe so you can catch up on all the latest episodes as they come out. See you next time.
Want to skip the learning curve and launch a top-tier podcast right off the bat? Then let the professionals handle it for you. At Podcast.co, we offer an all-in-one production service for brands, artists and thought leaders, and we take care of every single step, from branding and editing to marketing and distribution, and the results speak for themselves. Send an email to david@podcast.co today to learn about how we can work together.